December 22nd, 1944. 11:30 a.m. Bastogne, Belgium. The frozen breath hung in the air as Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard watched 4 German officers approach through the snow, their white flags stark against the devastated landscape. They carried with them a message that would echo through history, an ultimatum demanding surrender, wrapped in the confident mockery of certain victory. The fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The German officers waited, supremely confident. They had every reason to be. 18,000 Americans were trapped, surrounded by approximately 30,000 German troops with hundreds of tanks. No supplies could reach them. The weather had grounded all Allied aircraft. The nearest relief forces were over 100 miles away. What they didn't know was that 130 miles to the south, General George S. Patton had just made a promise so audacious that even Eisenhower thought he was joking. A promise that would require moving an entire army through impossible winter conditions faster than any military force had ever moved before. The mathematics of war were about to be rewritten not by superior numbers or better equipment, but by the collision of German overconfidence with American determination, and by the sheer audacity of a general who refused to believe in the word impossible. The transformation had begun 6 days earlier, in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1944. At precisely 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes forest erupted with a violence that hadn't been seen on the Western Front since 1940. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, their shells screaming through the frozen air toward unsuspecting American positions. Among them was Private First Class Robert Leckie of the 99th Infantry Division, who would later write in his diary, "The earth shook beneath us. Trees exploded into splinters. The very air seemed to scream. We had been told the Germans were finished. We had been told wrong. This was Operation Rhine, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last desperate gamble to reverse the tide of war." In absolute secrecy, the Wehrmacht had assembled 410,000 troops, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 2,600 artillery pieces. They had moved this massive force through the dense Eifel forests at night, maintaining radio silence, using horses to move supplies to avoid engine noise. General Major Heinz Kokott, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, recorded the moment before the attack. The soldiers stood silent in the darkness, their breath freezing in clouds before their faces. They knew what was at stake. This was not just another offensive. This was our last chance. The target was the weakest point in the Allied line. For American divisions spread thin across difficult terrain, many of them new to combat or recuperating from earlier battles. The Germans achieved complete tactical surprise. Within hours, entire American units were overrun or retreating in chaos. But the German plan had one critical requirement: speed. They needed to capture the vital road junction at Bastogne within 48 hours. 7 major roads converged there, roads that German tanks needed to reach their ultimate objective, the port of Antwerp, 125 miles away. Without Bastogne, the entire offensive would stall. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps tasked with taking Bastogne. His force was formidable. The elite 2nd Panzer Division with 88 tanks and assault guns, the veteran Panzerlehr Division with 57 tanks, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division with 17,000 infantry. Racing toward the same objective from the opposite direction was the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. They had been resting in Reims, France, recovering from 72 days of combat in Holland when the call came. No winter clothing, no time to prepare, just grab your weapons and get on the trucks. December 17th, 9 p.m. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit as the first trucks carrying the 101st Airborne rolled through the darkness toward Bastogne. Private Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment remembered the journey vividly. We passed endless columns of American troops heading the opposite direction, retreating. Some had no weapons, many had no helmets. They shouted at us through the darkness, go back, they'll kill you all. One soldier, his eyes wide with terror, grabbed my arm and said, "There's thousands of them. Tigers, panthers, everything." Pushed him away. We weren't going back. The convoy stretched for miles, 380 trucks carrying the division through the night. They had no idea what they were heading into. Maps were scarce. Intelligence was contradictory. All they knew was that they had to reach Bastogne before the Germans. The 101st Airborne Division had an effective strength of 805 officers and 11,035 enlisted men, a total of 11,840. This included 4 infantry regiments, the 501st, 502nd, and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments, plus the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, along with 4 artillery battalions and various support units. Leading elements of the 501 PIR reached Bastogne at 11:30 p.m. on December 18th. They had beaten the main German force by just hours. Team de Sobry, a combat team from the 10th Armored Division commanded by Major William de Sobry, had already established a roadblock at Noville, 3 miles north of Bastogne. At dawn on December 19th, they made first contact with the German spearheads. Sergeant William McCloskey, a tank commander with Team de Sobry, described the initial encounter. The fog was so thick you couldn't see 50 yards. Then we heard them, the deep rumble of German armor. When the first Panther emerged from the mist, it looked like a monster. Our 75mm rounds bounced off its front armor like ping-pong balls. We had to let them get close, dangerously close, to hit them from the side. The battle for Noville raged all day. Team de Sobry, with just 15 Sherman tanks, faced the entire 2nd Panzer Division. They held for 48 hours, destroying 31 German tanks before being ordered to withdraw. Major de Sobry was severely wounded when a German shell hit his command post, but his sacrifice had bought precious time. December 20th brought a new commander to Bastogne. Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe arrived to take temporary command of the 101st Airborne while Maxwell Taylor was in Washington. McAuliffe was an artillery officer by training, known for his calm demeanor under pressure. He would need every ounce of that composure in the coming days. The situation map in McAuliffe's headquarters told a grim story. German forces were closing in from 3 directions. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division was infiltrating from the south and east. Panzerlehr was pushing from the east. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division threatened from the north. By noon on December 20th, the last road into Bastogne, the highway to Neufchâteau, was cut. Captain Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506 PIR, positioned his men in foxholes along the perimeter. We could hear German tanks moving in the darkness beyond our lines. The men were digging their foxholes deeper, using helmets and bare hands when entrenching tools broke in the frozen ground. The temperature was near zero. Men's feet were already turning black from frostbite. Inside Bastogne, the civilian population of 3,000 huddled in cellars as German artillery began systematically destroying the town. Renée Lemaire, a 30-year-old Belgian nurse, worked tirelessly in the aid station on Rue Neufchâteau, caring for both American and German wounded. She would not survive the siege. The defenders of Bastogne now numbered approximately 18,000 men. The 101st Airborne Division with its 11,840 personnel. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, under Colonel William Roberts with approximately 40 operational tanks and 2,800 men. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion with their M18 Hellcats. The All-African American 969th Artillery Battalion and various other artillery and support units. December 21st dawned with visibility less than 100 yards. Thick fog mixed with snow, creating a white shroud that made movement nearly impossible. The U.S. Army Meteorological Report described conditions as extremely adverse for any military operations. For the Germans, this weather was a gift. It grounded the Allied fighter bombers that had terrorized German columns since D-Day. Oberstleutnant von Lauchert, commanding elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, noted, "The weather is our ally. Without their aircraft, the Americans are just men like us and we have more tanks." But the weather cut both ways. German tanks struggled through the mud created by alternating freeze and thaw cycles. Fuel consumption doubled as vehicles fought through the mire. Supply trucks jackknifed on icy roads. Wounded men froze to death before medical aid could reach them. Inside Bastogne's perimeter, ammunition was running dangerously low. The artillery was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. Medical supplies were virtually exhausted after the capture of the medical company on December 19th. Morphine had to be reserved for only the most severe casualties. Food supplies dwindled to 1 meal per day. Private First Class James Sims of the 101st later recalled, "We were eating snow for water. My buddy next to me in the foxhole had his feet frozen to his boots. When the medic finally cut them off, his toes came off with them. He didn't even cry. He was beyond feeling anything." 130 miles south of Bastogne, at Verdun, a very different scene was unfolding on December 19th. In a cold, damp French barracks heated by a single pot-bellied stove, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had called an emergency conference of his senior commanders. The room was filled with the top brass of the Allied forces: Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, and Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief, had just finished briefing them on the German breakthrough. The silence that followed was oppressive. Eisenhower broke it with words that would define the American response. "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table." Patton immediately grinned. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the sons of bitches go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up." Eisenhower turned serious. "George, I need you to attack north. How quickly can you disengage from your current offensive and pivot toward Bastogne?" What Patton said next stunned every officer in the room. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room erupted in disbelief. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder actually laughed. Moving an entire corps 90 degrees in winter conditions, across 100 miles of icy roads, in 48 hours. It was impossible. Eisenhower's face flushed. Don't be fatuous, George. If you try to go that early, you won't have all 3 divisions ready and you'll go piecemeal. You'll be destroyed. But Patton wasn't boasting. For 3 days his brilliant operations officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been warning him about the German buildup in the Ardennes. Patton had already prepared 3 different operational plans for exactly this contingency. He had prepositioned fuel dumps, ammunition supplies, and medical units along potential routes north. I'm not being fatuous, Ike, Patton replied calmly. I've already issued preliminary orders. My staff is working on 3 possible axes of advance. All I need is your word. He pulled out a map and showed Eisenhower the routes. I'll use Milliken's 3rd Corps. The 4th Armored will lead, followed by the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions. We'll hit them from Arlin, drive through to Bastogne. Eisenhower studied the map. The distance was staggering. The weather was abysmal. The roads were sheets of ice. But Bastogne had to be relieved. When can you start? December 22nd, morning. Do it. As Patton left the meeting, he called his headquarters with a prearranged code word. Play ball. Those 2 words set in motion one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers in military history. Within hours, 133,000 vehicles began moving north. The entire Third Army, 250,000 men, had to be reoriented. Supply dumps that had been positioned for an offensive into Germany had to be relocated. 20,000 miles of telephone wire had to be restrung. Artillery positions calculated for one direction had to be completely recalculated for another. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, received his orders at 7 p.m. on December 19th. His unit had to move 150 miles in 19 hours through a blizzard. We drove with blackout lights through the night, he later recalled. Tank commanders stood in their turrets freezing, guiding drivers who couldn't see the road. Men fell asleep standing up and had to be physically shaken awake. The logistics were staggering. Each Sherman tank consumed 175 gallons of fuel for the journey. The division needed 50,000 gallons just to reach the start line. Fuel trucks drove continuously, many sliding off icy roads into ditches. When trucks broke down, fuel was transferred by hand using 5-gallon jerry cans. Master Sergeant Frank Caracello of the 4th Armored Maintenance Company worked for 72 straight hours. We changed track blocks on tanks while they were still moving into position. Men's hands froze to the metal. We had cases where skin came off when they pulled their hands away, but nobody stopped. We all knew those paratroopers in Bastogne were counting on us. Back in Bastogne, the situation had become critical. The perimeter had shrunk to less than 16 miles. German artillery had zeroed in on every strong point. The aid stations were overflowing with wounded. At 11:30 a.m. on December 22nd, German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They were met by soldiers of F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The German party consisted of Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps, Lieutenant Helmuth Haenke of Panzerler Operations Section, and 2 enlisted men from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Major Wagner carried a typed ultimatum on 2 sheets, one in English, one in German. The English version had been typed on an English typewriter, with German diacritical marks added by hand. When brought to the command post, the message was immediately taken to General McAuliffe, who was catching a brief nap in the basement of the Belgian barracks serving as headquarters. When Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore awakened him and said, "The Germans have sent some people forward to take our surrender," McAuliffe's immediate response was, "Nuts." His staff gathered around as he read the full German message aloud. It spoke of the hopeless position of the American forces, warning that German artillery is ready to annihilate the USA troops, and that only surrender could save them from total annihilation. Colonel Moore asked what the response should be. McAuliffe was genuinely puzzled. "Well, I don't know what to say." Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard spoke up. "What you said first would be hard to beat, General." McAuliffe laughed. "You mean nuts?" The room erupted in agreement. McAuliffe sat down and penned the response that would become legendary. To the German commander, "Nuts." The American commander. When Colonel Joseph Harper delivered the response to the waiting German officers, they were confused. "Nuts? What does this mean?" Harper couldn't resist. "It means go to hell. And I'll tell you something else. If you attack again, we'll kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." Major Wagner stiffened. "We will kill many Americans. This is war." "On your way, Bud," Harper replied, "and good luck to you." General Otto von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, later admitted he was surprised the ultimatum was even sent. Panzer Division sent a parlementaire to Bastogne without my authorization. The demand to surrender was refused, as was to be expected. The German reaction to McAuliffe's defiant response was swift and brutal. That evening, the Luftwaffe launched its first major bombing raid on Bastogne. For the defenders in their foxholes, it was a preview of hell. Corporal Walter Gordon of Easy Company described the bombing. "The ground shook like an earthquake. Trees burst into flames. Shrapnel whizzed through the air like angry hornets. We pressed ourselves into the frozen earth and prayed. The temperature plummeted to near 10 degrees Fahrenheit. In the foxholes along the perimeter, men took turns sleeping to prevent freezing to death. They learned to urinate in empty ration cans rather than leave their holes. Exposure for even a few minutes could mean death from sniper fire or frostbite. Food had become desperate. The official ration was 1K ration per day, about 2,800 calories when men needed 4,000 in the extreme cold. Soldiers learned to save the wax-coated cardboard from ration boxes. It burned long enough to heat a canteen of snow into drinkable water. Technical Sergeant Donald Malarkey found a creative solution. We discovered that the dead German horses, there were hundreds of them, were frozen solid, fresh meat. We'd hack off chunks with bayonets and cook them over fires made from broken ammunition boxes. Tasted terrible, but it kept us alive. December 24th brought both hope and horror to Bastogne. The weather had finally begun to clear, raising hopes for aerial resupply. But it also enabled the Luftwaffe to launch its most devastating raid. At 8:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, German bombers appeared over Bastogne. One of their bombs scored a direct hit on the aid station where René Lemaire was working. The building collapsed, trapping dozens of wounded soldiers and medical personnel. Corporal Kenneth Moore was outside when the bomb hit. I heard the explosion and ran toward the building. Where the aid station had been was just a pile of rubble. We could hear voices underneath, men crying for help, calling for their mothers. We dug with our bare hands through the night, pulling out bodies. Miss Lemaire was dead. She had stayed with the wounded who couldn't be moved. 30 American soldiers died in that one bombing, along with the Belgian nurse who had become a symbol of hope for the wounded. Augusta Chewy, a Congolese-Belgian nurse, survived and continued treating wounded for 30 straight hours after the bombing. As Christmas Eve turned to Christmas Day, Patton's Third Army was struggling through blizzard conditions. The attack that had begun on December 22nd was behind schedule. The 4th Armored Division had advanced only 7 miles in 3 days. Patton, never one for traditional military solutions, had summoned his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, on December 22nd. "Chaplain, I want you to publish a prayer for good weather. I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans. See if you can't get God to work on our side." O'Neill was dubious. "Sir, it's going to take a pretty thick rug for that kind of praying." "I don't care if it takes a flying carpet," Patton replied. "I want you to get up a prayer for good weather." The prayer was printed on 250,000 cards and distributed to every soldier in Third Army. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee of Thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Whether by divine intervention or meteorological coincidence, December 23rd dawned crystal clear. For the first time in a week, the sun broke through the clouds. The weather break was miraculous. After 7 days of impenetrable fog and snow, visibility suddenly stretched to 10 miles. The temperature rose above freezing for the first time in a week. More importantly, the Allied air forces could finally fly. At 9:50 a.m., the first Pathfinder aircraft appeared over Bastogne, dropping colored smoke to mark drop zones. By 11:50 a.m., the sky was filled with C-47 transport planes, 241 of them in perfect formation. Sergeant Jack Agnew of the Pathfinder team recalled, "We popped purple smoke to mark the drop zone. Then we heard them, a low rumble that grew into a roar. The sky turned dark with aircraft, the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. The paratroopers in Bastogne erupted in cheers. Men climbed out of foxholes, waving their helmets, many with tears streaming down their faces. For 7 days they had been alone. Now the sky was full of help. The first parachutes blossomed at 11:55 a.m. Supplies began raining down. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, blankets, and most critically, artillery shells. Of 1,446 bundles dropped, 95% were successfully recovered. Captain James Parker of the 101 Estes G4 Logistics Section coordinated the recovery. Men ran through artillery fire to grab those bundles. I saw a private get hit by shrapnel, get back up and drag a bundle to cover with blood streaming down his face. But the Germans hadn't been idle. Anti-aircraft guns positioned around Bastogne opened fire. The C-47s had to fly straight and level at 1,000 feet to drop accurately. They were sitting ducks. By December 26th, aircraft had delivered 1,020.7 tons by parachute and 92.4 tons by glider. The biggest airlift came on December 26th with 289 planes flying the Bastogne run. At 2:45 a.m. on Christmas morning, German artillery launched the heaviest barrage yet on Bastogne. For 2 hours, shells rained down on the American positions. Then, at 5:30 a.m., 18 Panzer Mark IV tanks of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, accompanied by infantry in white camouflage, attacked the western perimeter. The attack was led by Lieutenant Colonel Wolfgang Mock. His orders from General McAuliffe were simple. Bastogne must fall today. It is the Führer's Christmas wish. The German tanks broke through the first line of foxholes held by Company A, 327th Glider Infantry. Private First Class Kenneth Hendricks was in the second line. The ground was shaking from the tank engines. In the dawn light, they looked like monsters. Our bazooka rounds bounced off their armor. But the Americans had positioned their tank destroyers perfectly. The M18 Hellcats of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had been hidden in rubbled buildings. As the German tanks passed, they opened fire from the flanks. Sergeant Bill Harper commanded one of the Hellcats. We let them roll past, then hit them in the arse where the armor was thin. My gunner, Corporal Johnson, was incredible. 5 shots, 3 kills. By 10 a.m., all 18 German tanks were burning wrecks. Nearly 400 German soldiers lay dead in the snow. One captured German officer told his interrogators, "Your defense was magnificent." We knew after this morning we could not take Bastogne. General McAuliffe issued his Christmas message to the troops, recounting the German surrender demand and his reply, adding, "We have stopped cold everything that has been thrown at us from the north, east, south, and west." December 26th, 4 p.m. Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding Sherman Tank Cobra King of the 37th Tank Battalion, peered through his periscope at the Belgian village of Assenois, just 4 miles from Bastogne. For 4 days, the 4th Armored Division had been fighting through German positions, advancing yard by bloody yard. The final assault began at 2:20 p.m. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams ordered his battalion forward while calling for artillery support. "I want every gun you've got," he radioed. Within minutes, 2,340 artillery rounds were falling on German positions around Assenois. Boggess recalled the moment. "I could see German troops running from their foxholes as our artillery walked through their positions. When the barrage lifted, Abrams gave the order, 'Move out.' We charged through at full speed, all guns blazing. Private James Hendricks, bow gunner in Cobra King, described the breakthrough. We went through that town like a hot knife through butter. Germans were shooting at us from windows, doorways, everywhere. Our 75mm main gun was swinging left and right, firing point-blank into buildings. At 4:50 p.m., Cobra King crested a small rise and Boggess saw American soldiers ahead. They were engineers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, the outer perimeter of Bastogne's defenses. "Come on in," shouted the engineers. "You're the first tanks we've seen in 10 days. Boggess radioed Abrams. Contact with friendly forces established. The siege was broken, but the cost had been terrible. The 37th Tank Battalion had lost 5 killed, 22 wounded, and 5 missing in the breakthrough. The 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion suffered 20 killed, 93 wounded, and 10 missing during the final push alone. While the Cobra King carved out a minuscule breach, the battle was far from over. The 4th Armored Division had opened a corridor only 300 yards wide into the village of Assenois. For the next several days, Americans had to fight ferociously to widen and secure this fragile supply line, which the Germans incessantly shelled and attacked. For the men trapped in Bastogne, the arrival of that first tank was a vital shot of adrenaline, but not the end of their ordeal. On the afternoon of December 26th, the first jeeps loaded with supplies arrived at McAuliffe's headquarters. They carried what was most urgently needed: artillery ammunition and blood plasma for the aid stations. Colonel Harry Kinnard, the officer who had woken McAuliffe for the ultimatum, watched the first supply column arrive. There were no wild celebrations, just a stoic sense of relief. McAuliffe's message to General Patton was short: "Thanks for the Christmas present." By December 27th, the corridor was widened to several hundred yards, allowing for the evacuation of the hundreds of critically wounded men who had languished in the crowded, freezing subterranean aid stations for days. Ambulances departed with blackout lights, driving slowly over the icy, still contested roads. McAuliffe and his men had accomplished the impossible. The siege itself lasted 5 critical days, but the Battle for Bastogne had been a brutal, non-stop fight for 10 days. The breaking of the siege was not merely a tactical victory. It was the death blow to the entire Ardennes offensive. Hitler's plan, Operation Watch on the Rhine, rested on 2 critical assumptions. First, that tactical surprise would allow for a rapid dash to Antwerp, and second, that American troops, deemed soft and weak, would quickly surrender in the face of a massive armored assault. Bastogne disproved both. The resistance of the 101st Airborne had stalled von Luttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps and the Panzer-Lehr Division for crucial days. Instead of racing toward the Meuse River and Antwerp, the elite German units were forced into grinding house-to-house combat and the icy forests. Every day spent at Bastogne meant one more day for Patton's Third Army to arrive and, crucially, one more day for the weather to break, unleashing the full might of Allied air power. By December 26th, with the supply corridor open and Patton's 4th Armored Division making contact, von Luttwitz realized his mission had failed. German orders shifted from assaulting Bastogne to surrounding and containing Patton's relief forces. But it was too late. German fuel and ammunition reserves were critically low. Their logistics chain, based on the hope of capturing Allied depots, had been shattered. In the ensuing days, as Patton pushed north to fully link the front, German morale plummeted. The propaganda that had driven them to believe in an easy victory was exposed as a brutal lie. The Battle for Bastogne, and the Battle of the Bulge as a whole, represented the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the U.S. Army in World War II. In Bastogne alone, losses were staggering. The 101st Airborne Division suffered 341 killed, 2,059 wounded, and 765 missing, a total of 3,165 men out of an 11,000-man strength, over 28% of the fighting force. This was in addition to the losses suffered by attached units like the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion and Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division. On the German side, the figures were even more disastrous. The offensive cost the Third Reich an estimated 100,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and captured, over 800 tanks and assault guns, and thousands of support vehicles. These were irreplaceable losses for an economy and an army that were already staggering. The true victory of Bastogne was not simply survival, but the sacrifice of time and material it inflicted on the enemy. The thing that struck me most wasn't fear, but the discipline of the men. They were frozen, they were hungry, some hadn't slept for days, but when the officer said, "Fire," they fired. When he said, "Dig," they dug. That was the thing that broke the Germans' back. Master Sergeant Frank Caracello, 4th Armored Division, veteran testimony. The story of Bastogne is cemented by the interplay of 2 titanic military personalities, each representing a different kind of audacity. Brigadier General Anthony C. McAuliffe. His audacity was defensive and psychological. His legendary one-word reply, "Nuts," was not a random outburst, but a perfect act of psychological warfare. It communicated to his men, and indirectly to the Germans, that the entire division had an unshakable confidence in victory and relief. He turned desperation into scornful mockery of German arrogance. General George S. Patton, Jr. His audacity was offensive and logistical. The feat of pivoting an entire army of 250,000 men 90 degrees and moving them over 100 miles in 48 hours through the worst European winter in decades was deemed impossible by his peers. Patton not only planned ahead, but his obsessive attention to logistics, from fuel trucks to the prayer for good weather, proved that a commander's will could overcome the laws of military kinetics. The collision between the stubborn tenacity of the Screaming Eagles of the 101st and the unprecedented speed of Patton's Third Army created a vice that crushed the last great German offensive on the Western Front. While the battle continued to rage in the Ardennes throughout January, the outcome of the war was now sealed. Hitler had gambled away his last strategic reserves on an unreachable objective, leaving the Eastern Front vulnerable to the final Soviet advance. On January 18, 1945, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons regarding the Ardennes offensive. His words resonated across the Atlantic, a formal and heartfelt recognition of America's role. This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and I think it will be recorded as an ever-famous American victory. Churchill recognized that the Americans had not only held the line but had turned a potential disaster into a strategic opportunity that hastened the end of the war in Europe. German General Otto von Manschufel, whose forces sustained crippling losses, summarized the change in perception the battle had forged. The resistance at Bastogne and Patton's rapid counterattack showed us an American determination we had not encountered before. We were convinced of their imminent surrender. Instead, we saw a fighting force that, even when surrounded, did not know the meaning of the word quit. Bastogne was not a place of brilliant maneuver, but of pure, brutal determination. In the deep freeze, against seemingly impossible odds, the men of the 101st Airborne and their attached units proved themselves the embodiment of resistance at a pivotal moment. When the Cobra King broke through at Assenois, it brought not just ammunition, but the confirmation that audacity, logistical preparation, and simple, stubborn will to hold were the true aces that would secure the Allied victory and the future of the free world. Their story is an enduring testament to the resilience of the American soldier. The camera pulls back from an aerial, nighttime view of the Bastogne Battle Memorial, the Martison. And so, as the lights of winter faded, the siege of Bastogne ended, but its impact still resonates today. It was at Bastogne that Hitler's dream of a final victory froze, and it was in the courage of those men that the alliance was cemented and the course of the war was decided. A single word, nuts, became the battle cry not just for one division, but for an entire generation of soldiers who refused to believe in the impossible.